Abraham is one of the most fascinating characters in the Bible. His life was defined by steps of faith that would go on to change the world. Abraham was the first of the Hebrew patriarchs. Aside from Moses, no Old Testament character is mentioned more often than Abraham in the New Testament. James refers to Abraham as God's friend, a unique title James reserves for Abraham. Abraham's importance and impact in salvation history are evident in the Bible. The life of Abraham takes up a good portion of the Genesis narrative from his first mention in Genesis chapter 11 verse 26 to his death in Genesis chapter 25 verse 8. Although we know much about Abraham's life, we know little about his birth and early life. Some scholars suggest that Abraham's ancestors were idolaters and polytheists. Joshua reminds the people that their forefathers, including Terah the father of Abraham and Nahor, lived beyond the river and worshipped other gods. In the Jewish tradition called Midrash, there are a number of stories about Abraham smashing his father's idols when he realizes that there can be only one God of heaven and earth. Such stories acknowledge that Abraham was the first person to recognize and worship the one God. When we first meet Abraham, he is already 75 years old. Genesis chapter 11 verse 28 records that Abraham's father, Terah, lived in Ur, an influential city in southern Mesopotamia situated on the Euphrates River about halfway between the head of the Persian Gulf and the modern-day city of Baghdad. In Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, Abraham is a venerated patriarch whose relationship with God provides the foundational story for God's relationship with humanity. Abraham is remembered in the Bible as the father of faith and the ancestor of the Israelites. The three great monotheistic religions such as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam recognize Abraham as their ancestor. Similarly, Judaism understands Abraham's promised offspring as the Jewish people descended from Abraham's son, Isaac, born of his wife, Sarah. Similarly, Christianity traces the genealogy of Jesus to Isaac and interprets Abraham's near sacrifice of Isaac as a foreshadowing of Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. Islam understands that Ishmael, Abraham's firstborn son, born of Hagar, fulfills God's promise, and the Prophet Muhammad is his descendant. According to the biblical book of Genesis, Abraham left Ur in Mesopotamia because God called him to found a new nation in an undesignated land that he later learned was Canaan. Despite the inherent dangers of traveling at such an old age and through unknown and unfriendly territory, Abraham trusted God and started his journey to the promised land. It is to be noted, however, that Abraham had his moments of failure as well. For example, we know of at least 2 occasions in which Abraham lied regarding his relationship with Sarah to protect himself in potentially hostile lands such as Genesis chapter 12 verse 10-20 and Genesis chapter 20 verses 1-18. God protects and blesses Abraham despite his lack of faith in both these incidents. Abraham's failures do not shadow his exemplary life. We have many lessons to draw from Abraham. One obvious lesson to draw from Abraham's life is that we are to live a life of faith. Abraham could take his son Isaac up to Mount Moriah because he knew God was faithful to keep his promises. Abraham's faith wasn't blind faith, his faith was a settled assurance and trust in the one who had proved himself faithful and true. Abraham's life also shows us the blessing of simple obedience. When asked to leave his family, Abraham left. When asked to sacrifice Isaac, Abraham rose up early the next morning. From what we can discern from the biblical narrative, Abraham's obedience was absolute. Like most of us, Abraham may have agonized over these decisions, but he acted when it was time to work. When we discern a genuine call from God or read his instructions in his word, we must perform. Obedience is not optional when God commands something. We also see from Abraham what it looks like to have a dynamic relationship with God. While Abraham was quick to obey, he did not shy away from asking God questions. For example, in Genesis chapter 18, we read the account of Abraham interceding for Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham affirmed that God was holy and just and could not fathom him destroying the righteous with sinners. He asked God to spare the sinful cities for the sake of 50 righteous and continued to work the number down until 10. Ultimately there were not 10 honest men in Sodom, but God spared Abraham's nephew Lot and family. Abraham's example shows us what it looks like to interact with God regarding his plans, intercede for others, trust God's justice, and submit to his will.